CD4.
He was obviously not the first parent to have that feeling, but it had a different meaning now that he was racked by pain, and death was about to win the last battle. And to think that for a long time he hadn't wanted to have children. He had grown up in a dysfunctional family, what with his father's alcoholism and his mother's mental instability. It was not the kind of childhood to make someone want to be a father. Even now, the most vivid memories he had of that time were images of violence and fear, and he knew that they had blocked his way to fatherhood for a long time. It was hard to explain why. Probably fear of being unable to love and of causing pain himself. But one thing was certain. The idea of becoming a father reminded him so strongly of his own childhood suffering that he had refused to have a baby with the only woman he'd ever loved. And when he thought about that, it broke his heart. Then Elena had died, and the next 10 years had been nothing but an endless nightmare. He'd sunk into despair, able to keep his head above water only because of Matt and his work, to which he'd clung as though it were a life preserver. He had, of course, met other women, but they'd passed through his life without stopping for very long, and for his part, he'd been careful never to hold on to any of them. But one day, at a medical conference in Italy, he'd met a cardiologist from Milan. It had just been a brief affair, a weekend, and they hadn't kept in touch. But 9 months later, she'd told him that she had just given birth to a baby girl, and that the child was his. This time he was faced with a fait accompli. There was no way he could get out of it, especially because the cardiologist didn't really have any maternal instincts and had no intention of raising the child on her own. 3 months after the birth, Elliot had gone to pick Angie up in Italy, and by mutual agreement, the child saw her mother afterward only during vacations. So, without preparation, he'd become a father, and his life had been transformed. After a season in hell, his life finally had meaning. From then on, every night before going to bed, the last thing he did was to make sure that his daughter was peacefully asleep. The word future was once again in his vocabulary, in a prominent place next to bottle, diaper, and baby formula. Of course, there was more pollution than ever. The ozone layer was deteriorating. The world was going to hell. Consumer society was becoming increasingly unbearable, and his work didn't leave him a free moment. But this all seemed suddenly unimportant faced with a baby weighing only a few pounds, with her bright eyes and her fragile smile. Now, as he watched her walking toward him in the restaurant, he remembered those early years when he'd raised her on his own, with no woman to help him. At first he'd thought he wouldn't make it. He'd panicked for a little while. How did you go about being a father? He had no idea, and it wasn't explained anywhere. Sure, he was a pediatric surgeon, but that didn't help very much in everyday life. If she'd needed to have a ventricle sewn up or a quadruple bypass, he would have been useful, but that wasn't the problem. Then he'd understood the great secret. You're not born a father, you become one, by improvising along the way the course you guess to be right for your child. He'd waited 40 years to find out that there was no answer, no solution, just love. It was what Elena had always told him. And he'd always answered, if only it were so easy, when all the time it was. "Hi, Dad," said Angie, as she bent over to kiss him. "Hello, Wonder Woman," he answered, looking at her short skirt and thigh-high boots. "How was your flight?" "Great," Angie sat down on the opposite stool and put a large key ring and a tiny chrome-plated cell phone on the table. "I'm as hungry as a bear," she said, and picked up the menu to make sure her favorite burger was still on it. Once she had reassured herself, she started talking enthusiastically, telling hundreds of stories about her medical studies and her life in New York. She was smart and generous, very idealistic, and always wanted to do her best at everything she undertook. Elliot had not especially pushed her to become a doctor, but she cared about other people and said she got that from him. To him, she looked relaxed, glowing, magnificent. Mesmerized by her outbursts of laughter, he wondered how he'd be able to tell her about his disease. It wouldn't be easy for a 20-year-old girl to suddenly find out that her father had terminal cancer and had only 2 or 3 months to live. He knew his daughter well. Even after she'd left for New York, they'd stayed very close. Despite her appearance and her woman's body, Angie was still emotionally a child, and he was sure she wouldn't react calmly to what he was going to tell her. In his profession, several times a week he had to tell tearful people that their child, their spouse, or their parent hadn't survived an operation. It was always a hard moment, but with time he'd come to accept that aspect of his job. Yes, as a doctor he was faced with death every day, but it was the death of others, not his own. Of course, he was a little afraid of what was going to happen to him. He didn't really believe in eternal life or any form of reincarnation. He knew that what awaited him was not only the end of his life on Earth, but the end of his life, period. His body would go up in smoke in an incinerator, and Matt would probably scatter his ashes in a pleasant place, and that would be it, end of the road. That's what he would have liked to be able to explain calmly to his daughter, that she shouldn't worry about him because he'd be able to deal with the situation. Besides, if he thought about it objectively, his dying wasn't such an outrage. He wouldn't have turned his nose up at another few decades, but he'd had enough time to savor life, experience its joys, sorrows, and surprises. "How are you doing?" asked Angie out of the blue, breaking into his train of thought. He looked at her tenderly as she brushed her hair out of her piercing blue eyes. He felt his throat tighten and was overcome with emotion. Damn it, this is not the time to break down. "I have something to tell you, sweetheart." Angie's smile imperceptibly faded, as though she already knew bad news was coming. "What is it?" "I have a tumor in my lungs." "What?" she said, as though she didn't understand. "I have cancer." She let a few seconds go by in stunned silence, and then asked in a tight voice, You're going to recover?" "No, sweetheart. It's metastasized everywhere." "Shit." Overwhelmed, she held her head in her hands for a minute and then looked at him. A tear was running down her cheek. But she hadn't given up all hope. "But have you consulted specialists? There are new techniques to treat small cell cancer. Maybe if—" "It's too late," he interrupted, in a tone of finality. She wiped her eyes with the sleeve of her sweater, but it was no good. The tears kept flowing and she couldn't stop them. "How long have you known?" 2 months. "But why didn't you say anything?" "To protect you. To keep from hurting you." She was annoyed. "So for the last 2 months, every time we talked on the phone, you'd let me blabber on about my little problems, and you didn't bother to tell me that you had cancer?" "You were starting your first year of clinical study, and I hate you!" she shouted, and stood up. He tried to hold her back, but she pushed him away and ran out of the restaurant. By the time Elliot came out, it was pouring. The sky was black with clouds and thunder was rumbling. The doctor regretted having neither a raincoat nor an umbrella because his linen jacket was soaked through in less than 2 seconds. He very quickly realized that he would have trouble finding Angie. Traffic was backed up, buses were full, and taxis were all taken. At first he thought he'd go to the cable car terminal at the corner of Powell and Market, but soon gave up that idea. The rain hadn't discouraged the tourists who were crowded around the spot watching the operators work the cars with muscle power. He thought the wait would be too long and headed for Union Square, hoping he could catch a car on the way. The first 2 that went by were so full that he didn't even try. But he did manage to jump on the third just as it started the steepest part of its climb. He stayed on the car to the last stop, Fisherman's Wharf, the city's old fishing port, now taken over by tourist restaurants and souvenir shops. Shivering with cold, Elliot walked past the seafood stands, where fish sellers were shelling live crabs and plunging them into huge pots on the street. It was raining even harder when he got to Ghirardelli Square. He passed the old chocolate factory and arrived at Fort Mason. Soaked to the skin and shivering, he kept moving fast. The howling wind drove the rain straight into his face. The physical effort had brought back the burning sensation in his lungs and his lower back, but that wouldn't keep him from finding his daughter. He knew where she would go when she was upset. He finally came out onto the sandy beach between Marina Green and the former air base at Crissy Field. The sea was raging, and huge waves were throwing spray for dozens of yards. Elliot squinted. Golden Gate Bridge had almost disappeared, swallowed by fog and low-lying cloud. The beach was deserted, veiled with a heavy curtain of rain. He took a few steps and shouted at the top of his lungs, "Angie! Angie!" At first, only the wind answered. His eyes misted over with tears, and he felt weak and vulnerable, almost at the end of his rope. Then he sensed her presence, not knowing exactly where she was, and he heard, "Daddy?" Angie was running toward him through the streets of rain. "Don't die," she begged. "Don't die." He hugged her tightly, and they stood locked together for a long time, soaked, exhausted, shattered by grief. As he consoled his daughter, Elliot swore to himself that he would fight death with all his strength, to delay it as long as possible. Then, when the last moment came, he would depart in peace, because he knew that something of himself would persist beyond the nothingness. And he understood that this, too, was perhaps one of the reasons why men had children. Chapter 9. When it comes to books and friends, it's best to have only a few, but all good ones. Popular saying. 1976. Elliot is 30. When Elliot left the hospital after his night on call, he felt the chill of the early morning. Lost in thought and preoccupied by his worries, at first he didn't notice the little crowd in the parking lot. In among the ambulances and next to a fire truck, Matt was putting on a show for a small group of nurses. Torn between amusement and annoyance, Elliot looked on. With his cream-colored cotton suit and his wide-collared shirt open to the navel, Matt looked odd. A Travolta before his time, he was dancing to disco music coming from his car radio. It was still dark, but his improvised show was lit by the headlights from his Corvette. "You should be dancing," he sang in falsetto. His gap-toothed smile gave him a boyishly attractive air, and in a way Elliot couldn't help admiring his adventurous and free-spirited side. "What are you doing here?" he asked, when he got near the car. "You should be dancing," Matt repeated, and took his friend by the arm. He tried to pull Elliot into the dance, but the doctor refused to play along. "Have you been drinking?" He could smell the alcohol on Matt's breath. "Give me a minute to thank my audience, and I'll explain everything." Elliot frowned and climbed into the Corvette while Matt did a last pirouette. Won over by his charm, the nurses willingly applauded his performance and then went back to work. "It was an honor, ladies," he said with a bow. Then, intoxicated by his little triumph, he jumped over the car door and miraculously landed in the driver's seat. "And now fasten your seatbelt," he said, turning to Elliot. "What are you up to?" Elliot replied irritably. Matt didn't answer, but shifted into reverse and turned the car 180 degrees to face out of the lot. "I stopped at your place to pack your bags," he explained, pointing to a suitcase stuck behind the seats. "By the way, your whiskey bottle's empty." "What are you talking about?" "Your plane takes off at 9. "What plane?" The tires squealed as Matt roared out of the parking lot. After a few turns, they were on Van Ness, and a little pressure on the pedal pushed the V8 past 70. "You ever hear of speed limits?" said Elliot, hanging on to his seat. "Sorry, but we don't have much time." "Will you at least tell me where we're going?" "I'm not going anywhere," Matt answered calmly. "But you're going to Florida to see Elena." "What?" "You make up with her. You propose, and you have 2 or 3 beautiful children." "Are you nuts?" "Right now, I think you're the one with the screw loose, Elliot. Admit it. This story about a so-called time travel is bothering you." "It's bothering me because it really happened." Matt refused to get into an argument and tried to be reassuring. "Talk to Elena. Put things back together between you, and you see that everything will work out." "But I can't take off just like that. I've got several operations scheduled this weekend." Matt cut him off. "You're a surgeon, not God. The hospital will find someone to take your place." Elliot was suddenly very tempted by the prospect of seeing the woman he loved. He felt he needed to see her, but he still wasn't ready to let his feelings win over his professional conscience. What's more, he was going through a bad patch. His head of department, the fearsome and feared Dr. Amendoza, was harshly critical of his work, and delighted in putting him down at every opportunity. "Listen, Matt, thanks for trying to help, but I don't think it's such a good idea. I've only been working at the hospital for a few months, and I have to prove myself. On top of that, my department head thinks I'm a screw-up. So if I miss a few days, he'll make me pay for it, and I'll never get a permanent appointment." Matt shrugged his shoulders. "I've talked to Amendoza, and he agreed to give you until Monday off." "You're shitting me. You talked to Amendoza?" "Sure." "Sure you're shitting me, or sure you talked to Amendoza?" Matt shook his head. "This boss of yours realizes you haven't been all there the last few days. And for your information, he thinks highly of you." "You're joking." "The nurses told me. Amendoza tells everyone in the hospital that you're an excellent surgeon." "Everyone except me." "Yes, and that's why I'm here, to straighten you out when you need it." The clouds were slowly fading on the horizon, giving way to a rosy light that promised a beautiful day. Matt rummaged in his jacket pocket and pulled out an airline ticket. "Trust me, I know what's good for you." Elliot felt his defenses crumbling. But he tried to resist one last time. "And Tramp? Don't worry about your mutt. I'll feed him every day." He finally accepted the ticket gratefully, aware of how lucky he was to have a friend like Matt. For a moment, he recalled the strange circumstances of their meeting 10 years ago, and a tragic episode that they never talked about. This morning, he would have liked to say something to Matt to express his gratitude, but as usual, he couldn't find the words, and the Frenchman was the one who broke the silence. "If I hadn't met you, you know where I'd be now." Elliot shrugged his shoulders and didn't answer. Matt said simply, "I'd be dead." "Don't be stupid." "But it's true, and you know it." Elliot looked at his friend out of the corner of his eye. Matt's rumpled clothes and eyes red from lack of sleep revealed he'd been up all night. And that wasn't the only thing that bothered Elliot. His reckless driving, his intoxication, and his repeated references to death and the ghosts of the past. It was staring him in the face now. Matt, too, was going through a rough time. The good humor he displayed in every situation concealed his own dark side and pain. The way his cheerful disposition sometimes gave way to black thoughts and depression. "Let me tell you something," Matt said. "Every morning when I get up, I look at the sky and the ocean, and I tell myself that the only reason I'm still here to take advantage of them is you." "You're drunk, Matt." "Sure I'm drunk," he admitted. "You save lives, I get drunk. Because I can't do much of anything else except pick up girls and put on a show." He let a few seconds pass, then said, "But you know what? Maybe that's my mission on Earth. To take care of you and help you any way I can." He'd spoken solemnly. To try to mask his feelings and to keep the silence from growing too heavy, Elliot started talking about trivial things. "Your radio's not bad," he said, looking at the newly installed high-end radio-cassette combination. "Yeah, it's got a 10-watt amplifier," Matt explained, relieved to change the subject. "You bought the last Bob Dylan?" Matt chuckled. "Dylan's finished. This is the future," he said, and rummaged in the glove compartment for a cassette with a striking black and white cover. "Bruce Springsteen," Elliot read. "Never heard of him." Matt told him everything he knew about the unusual rock star who was growing more and more popular, singing about working-class lives in New Jersey. "You'll see," he said, and put the cassette in. "This stuff is dynamite." Born to Run started playing as the sun rose. For the rest of the drive, the two friends let themselves be carried by the music, each of them lost in thought. Elsewhere, but together. The airport finally appeared in the distance. Matt got on the approach road to the terminal and pulled up in front of the departure building with a squeal of tires. "Let's go, hurry up." Elliot grabbed his suitcase and ran toward the glass doors. He'd gone about 10 yards before he turned around and yelled to Matt, "If my plane crashes and I get to heaven first, do I keep a spot for you?" "Sure," Matt agreed. "A warm spot next to Marilyn Monroe. And not too far from you." Chapter 10. The strongest bond between two people isn't love, it's sex. Tarun J. Tepal, The Alchemy of Desire, page 11. The strongest bond between two people isn't sex, it's love. Tarun J. Tepal, The Alchemy of Desire, page 670. 1976. Elliot is 30. Ladies and gentlemen, we are about to begin our descent to Orlando. Kindly return to your seat, place your seat back in the upright position, and make sure that your seat belt is fastened. Elliot stopped looking out the window and turned toward the aisle. The plane was half empty. His friend could be as skeptical as he liked, but Elliot had no more doubts about the reality of what he'd just been through. He hadn't stopped examining the passengers, wondering whether he might see his 60-year-old double among them. Since the fingerprints had confirmed the identity of his strange visitor, he had been waiting for the next visit with a mixture of anxiety and impatience. The plane landed smoothly. Elliot quickly retrieved his suitcase, rented a car, and headed for Ocean World. After a night on call and a 6-hour flight during which he'd been unable to sleep, all his limbs felt stiff, and he was dropping with fatigue. He rolled down the window of the Mustang to breathe a little sea air. It was much warmer here than in San Francisco. Fall had not yet come to Florida. He got onto International Drive, lined with lush lawns and brand-new hotels. The town seemed to be on a perpetual vacation. It might all seem artificial, but he decided to play along. After he'd parked in the huge lot at Ocean World, he couldn't decide whether or not to call Elena from a phone booth. Finally, he decided he'd surprise her and bought a ticket like any other tourist. The Marine Park was a little town in itself, covering almost 150 acres and employing several hundred people. Since he was familiar with the park, he knew the spot where he would find Elena. To get there, he walked through the hilly garden with its pink flamingos surrounding the tropical aquarium and came out onto the little man-made beach where the giant tortoises lazed. From there, he continued alongside an enclosure in which a handful of alligators were basking in the sun, and finally reached the tank containing the killer whales. The place was impressive. The 6 killer whales in Ocean World lived in a tank that was 35 feet deep and held 12 million gallons of seawater. It was currently between shows, and the stands were almost empty. Unnoticed, Elliot took a seat and watched the trainers, busy with the whales. It didn't take him long to spot Elena. She was the only woman in the group. Wearing a diving suit, she was playing dentist, drilling a tooth for one of the whales, which was facing her with its jaw wide open. Elliot shivered and thought about those circus performers who put their head in a lion's mouth, even though he knew Elena wouldn't appreciate the comparison. This tall, slender creature from the sea was as beautiful as a siren, shining like a diamond on a heap of glass marble. Sometimes, when they went to a store or a restaurant, he let her go in first, and people momentarily wondered what kind of man could be accompanying such a fabulous woman. When their eyes finally turned to him, he always thought he could read a little disappointment in them. 2 trainers near the pool were sticking close to Elena as though hypnotized by her striking beauty. She laughed at their jokes like a good sport, but kept them at arm's length. Could he measure up to a woman like that? Had he managed to make her happy? He had avoided these questions for a long time, content to live in the moment, but today he was ready to face them. They still loved each other, of course, but life and work had separated them a little. Because of the distance between them and their careers, their relationship was now conducted in fits and starts. He often wondered what his life would be like if he hadn't met her 10 years ago. There was no doubt that she had made him a better person. She had had something to do with his calling as a doctor. She had given him confidence, and she had opened his eyes to the realities of the world. But what about him? What had he done for her? What had he given her? Maybe she'd wake up one morning and realize that she'd wasted her time staying with him. Then he'd have to accept losing her. "Losing you," he murmured, from his detached position, as though she could hear him. In any case, he was sure of one thing. He would do everything he could to make sure that day never came. As for what he could give her, would he agree to leave his job in the hospital and his life in San Francisco to come and live with her in Orlando? And he couldn't bring himself to answer that question. He could give his life for her, which had to reveal the strength of his feeling. Invigorated by this thought, he got up from the stands, thinking it was time to interrupt the mating dance of the two pretty boys hovering around Elena. "Hey, kid!" he called out to a teenager selling helium balloons. "Yes, sir?" "How much for the balloons?" "2 for $1. Elliot gave him $20, which more than paid for the whole bunch. Concealed behind it, he approached the tank noiselessly. "This area is not open to the public," one of the trainers interjected. Elliot knew some of the employees, but he'd never met this one. He glanced at him and saw the aggression on his face. Now there's the kind of guy who'd have a pissing contest, he thought, and kept going despite the warning. Well, I won't let this jerk spoil my surprise. But the trainer had other ideas. "Are you deaf or what?" he yelled, and pushed him. Elliot nearly stumbled and was forced to let go of the bunch of balloons to keep his balance. "Asshole!" he said angrily to the guy. The young trainer blocked his way, his fists clenched. "What's going on here?" asked Elena, walking in their direction. "This guy thinks he's at home," explained the trainer, pointing to Elliot. As the helium balloons rose upward, Elena was astonished to discover the face of the man she loved, and remained speechless for an instant. "It's okay, Jimmy. I'll take care of it," she said, when she recovered from her surprise. Regretfully, the trainer turned away from Elliot, murmuring, "Little shit." "Big asshole," Elliot replied in the same tone. As the trainer moved off, grumbling, Elliot and Elena stood 6 feet apart, looking at each other in silence. "I was in the area, so—" "Sure. Admit it. You can't live without me." "What about you?" "Me? I'm surrounded by men here. You ought to be worried." "I am worried. That's why I'm here." She looked at him defiantly. "By the way, I liked your tough guy routine." "Sorry about the fight with Jimmy." "Don't be sorry. I like it when you fight for me." He pointed upward. "I bought those for you." She looked up. Driven by the wind, the balloons were floating off into space. "If that's your love, it's flown away." He shook his head. "Love doesn't fly away so easily." "Better be careful, though. It can't be taken for granted." As the sun went down behind the palm trees, Elliot moved toward Elena. "I love you," he said simply. She threw herself into his arms, and he whirled her around as though they were 20 again. "I've had a thought," he said, as he put her down. "What?" she said, still clasped in his arms. "Suppose we have a baby." "Here, right now?" she answered, remembering the answer Elliot had given a few days earlier at the airport. "In front of the whales and the dolphins?" "Why not?" Elena parked the Thunderbird at the end of a gravel driveway leading to a charming pink brick house framed by white pillars and with a covered terrace on the upper floor. She'd been renting that floor for the last few months from Miss Abbott, a disagreeable old lady who was heiress to a rich Boston family but spent most of her time in Florida, where the climate seemed to be good for her rheumatism. Miss Abbott was a relic of the old school, and insisted that her tenants be members of good society. She had warned Elena several times that she was absolutely forbidden to have men in the house, which was not a brothel. Elena put her finger to her lips to tell Elliot not to make any noise. The house seemed still and quiet, and Miss Abbott was a little hard of hearing, but they had to be careful. They got out of the car without slamming the doors and went up the narrow fire escape single file to get into the apartment without going through the main entrance. Elliot went first, grumbling, none too happy about playing the role of an adolescent. Elena was finding the whole thing amusing until she heard, "Elena? Is that you?" The front door had just opened, and Miss Abbott had already come out onto the porch. "Hello, Miss Abbott." Nice day, isn't it? Elena said lightly. What are you doing there, Elena? The landlady asked, frowning. Suspicious, she moved away from the house so she could see the whole staircase. But Elliot had already had time to slip into the apartment. I thought you were asleep, and I didn't want to disturb you, Elena explained. The old woman shrugged her shoulders and asked in a gentler tone, Won't you have a cup of tea with me? Well, I made some cookies I think you'll like. They've just come out of the oven. Well, you see, it's an old recipe I got from my grandmother. I'll write it down for you if you like. I wouldn't want to deprive you. Not at all, she said, drawing Elena into the house. It's my pleasure. And from the tone of this statement, Elena guessed that Miss Abbott may not have been fooled by her ruse. Alone in the little apartment, Elliot was beginning to grow impatient. He slipped out of the room on tiptoe and tried to get a glimpse downstairs. He was dismayed to find that Elena had been trapped by the landlady. Sitting on a rocking chair with a cup of tea in her hand, she was listening distractedly as Miss Abbott listed the ingredients for her special cookies. He understood that Elena was stuck for a while and went back inside, patiently enduring the wait by examining the large room that smelled of incense and cinnamon. The place was cheerful, with candles everywhere, brightly colored cushions, and a few Indian trinkets. In a corner were an acoustic guitar, a tambourine, and sheet music for Joan Baez and Leonard Cohen songs. On the wall was a poster for Julie Jim that Matt had brought back for Elena from his last trip to Paris. On the night table, along with books about animal psychology, Elliot saw the latest Agatha Christie, and a novel with an eye-catching cover by a writer he didn't know, Carrie, by Stephen King. Distractedly, he'd read the blurb on the cover. Another writer who'll be forgotten in 5 years, he thought as he put it down. Continuing to roam, Elliot noticed an odd device, a kind of printed circuit enclosed in a koa wood case connected to the television set. Elena had bought it the previous summer in the Bite Shop in San Francisco for the tidy sum of $600. She had a scientific mind and was fascinated by the new machines called microcomputers. Elliot didn't know much about them. In the not-too-distant future, she had assured him, computers would be as common in houses as refrigerators or washing machines. Thinking about the whole thing, he couldn't keep from shrugging his shoulders. Even so, driven by curiosity, he skimmed a few pages of the manual on the desk. The machine was apparently fairly simple, having just a keyboard and cassette player. But Elliot couldn't figure it out at all. In fact, he would have been incapable of saying what a thing like that was actually for. The only fact he could pick up was the bizarre name its creators had chosen for their company. Apple Computer. You'll never get anywhere with a name like that, guys, he thought, not even daring to turn on the machine. Instead, he threw himself on the bed, picked up the Stephen King book, and started flicking through it while he waited for Elena. Within a half hour, he'd devoured nearly 100 pages. It's really not bad, he admitted almost against his will, as someone opened the door to the bedroom. The trees outside the window showed their autumn colors, bathing the room in a mellow, gentle light. Smiling and looking mischievous, Elena studied Elliot, apparently amused by what she saw. She was wearing faded bell-bottom jeans, a cheesecloth shirt, leather sandals, and a turquoise bracelet on her wrist. "I hope you at least brought me some cookies," he said jokingly. "I'm starting to get hungry." "Rest," she retorted, as she undid 2 buttons on her shirt. "Why do you say that?" "Because you're going to need all your strength." She clicks the door closed with her foot and goes over to the window to pull the curtains together. He takes hold of her and tries to draw her onto the bed. First, she pushes him off, only to draw him to her and press him against the wall. He frames her face with his hands. Elena's hair is still wet and smells of salt water. She loosens his belt and pulls his jeans down his thighs. He takes off her shirt, paying no heed to the buttons. She tastes the sweetness of his tongue as their lips part. She puts her arms around his neck, and he lifts her up as she wraps her legs around him. After a struggle with her bra, he lets his fingers run over her breasts, down to her bare stomach. Lower still, a moan. You and me. His name whispered in his ear. Cold hands caressing his sides and moving up his spine. They brace themselves against the back of a chair, knock it over, kneel on the rug, and then both fall against the wall. She rears above him, but he brings her back against his body. She holds her breath, tightens, and feels an icy shiver and then a burning wave sweep over her. Her body trembles and then completely relaxes. Outside, the wind has risen. A gust shakes the window, and one of the shutters flies open, hitting an earthenware vase that shatters on the ground. In the distance, a dog barks and someone shouts something. But they care nothing for the world outside, for people or dogs. Nothing else has any importance but the intoxication of losing themselves in one another, the vertigo of slipping into an abyss, and the fear of breaking the bond. Now she hangs on to anything she can, his hair, the odor of his skin, the taste of his lips. Her heart is beating so fast that it almost hurts, but she doesn't want the moment to end. Then there is something like a void, a hollow in her stomach, and something breaks inside her. Now she has the feeling that she is outside time, no longer on earth, that she is eternal, with another feeling of being projected a great distance to another place, out of this world. They lay stretched out in silence in the darkened room, pressed against one another, legs tangled and fingers interlaced. Night had fallen, and it had grown colder, but they were in their own warm and cozy cocoon. They were even starting to drift into sleep when the phone rang suddenly. Elena instantly shook off her drowsiness, wrapped a sheet around herself, and picked up the receiver. There was a silence, and, "Okay, I'll be right there." She hung up and turned to Elliot. "Sorry, baby. Don't tell me you have to leave. It's an emergency." "Who is it, a dolphin? A whale who needs you to sing a lullaby so he can get to sleep? We're short a trainer for the show, and I'm the only one who can replace him." She joined him on the bed and massaged his shoulders. "What show? It's 7 at night. Until the end of the season, there's a night show." "It's almost October. The season is over." "Not here, darling. This is Florida, and the weather's still good." She gave him a last kiss and got up. "You can stay here if you want. Don't worry about Miss Abbott. She goes to bed early. And if you want my opinion, she knows very well that you're here." "I'd rather go with you," he answered, without hesitation. "Afraid someone will try to pick me up?" "No, but I just remembered seeing a pretty girl behind the souvenir counter. I'll keep her company while you do your show." "If you do that, I'll kill you," she warned, and threw a pillow at him. In the blink of an eye, Elena put on her clothes and fixed her hair. "Sounds kind of extreme," Elliot observed, as he put on his shirt. "That's the way it is. If it has to be that way, then maybe this is the last time we'll ever sleep together." "Anyhow, it was good." "And that was stupid." "What? What you just said." "I don't have the right to say it was good?" "No." "Why?" "Because it breaks the spell." Women. Would he ever understand them? All the moments we spend together, he said, as he put on his jacket, I store in my mind like images from a film. That, on the other hand, was nice, she said, and closed the door behind her. Playing along with Miss Abbott, Elliot used the fire escape to get back to the car. When Elena could no longer hear him, he muttered to himself in a jokey tone, "Short films that I would play in my head if I were in a retirement home one day, old and impotent, just to remember how happy we were, the two of us." And on this point, at least, he had no idea how right he was. Chapter 11. Third Encounter. Yesterday I was still 20. I have been massaging time. Charles Aznavour. Yesterday, love was such an easy game to play. John Lennon and Paul McCartney. 1976. Elliot is 30. The aquatic cafe provided a spectacular view of the whale tank a few yards below, allowing visitors to the park to have a drink while they watched the show. In less than 15 minutes, the killer whales and their trainers would begin their display of choreography and spectacular feats. From his table, Elliot watched the sparsely populated stands gradually fill up for the last show of the day. A waiter brought the bottle of Budweiser he had ordered, and he nodded his thanks. The place was softly lit. Near the bar, a singer, accompanied by an acoustic guitar, was performing the hits of Carole King, Neil Young, and Simon and Garfunkel. Lulled by the sound of the guitar, and still feeling as though he were holding Elena, Elliot didn't notice the man who had just sat down at the table next to his. He took a sip of beer and automatically lit a cigarette. "So you're the one who took my lighter." As though he'd been caught doing something wrong, he immediately turned toward the man who'd just spoken to him. Sitting on the leather banquet next to his, the man, who he now knew was himself grown older, was looking at him with a glint of amusement in his eyes. Elliot was not surprised by this new appearance. He had prepared himself for it, and it confirmed his conviction that he had not dreamed what had happened. "I know everything," he said in a shaky voice. "What do you know?" "I know that you were telling the truth. I know that you are... me?" The man got up from the banquet, took off his jacket, and sat down opposite Elliot. "Pretty clever, your tattoo idea," he said, rolling up his sleeves so the letters were visible. "I knew you'd appreciate it." Seeing that he had a new customer, the waiter came up to their table. "What will you have, sir?" he asked the older man. "The same thing," he said, pointing to the bottle of Bud. "My friend and I often share the same tastes." The two men couldn't keep from smiling, and for the first time in this dimly lit cafe, an odd complicity seemed to bring them together. A full minute passed in silence. Each of them was appreciating in his own way the strange intimacy they now shared. It was a bizarre sensation, like finding a family member who had been missing for years. Finally, Elliot exclaimed, "Damn it, how do you do it?" "Time travel. If it makes you feel any better, it surprises me as much as you." "It's crazy." "Yes," he agreed. "It's crazy." Elliot took a puff of his cigarette. His head was spinning. "How is it there?" "You mean in 2006? "Yes." "What do you want to know?" He had lots of questions. 10, 100, 1,000. Starting with this one. "What's the state of the world?" "No better than it is now." "The Cold War?" "Over long ago. If only it were that simple." "The Russians or us?" "There was no Third World War. No nuclear bomb." "No, but we have other problems. The environment, globalization, terrorism, and all the consequences of September 11th. "September 11th? Yes, something happened on September 11th, 2001, at the World Trade Center in New York. What? Listen, I don't know if it's such a good idea for me to tell you about it. Too eager to find out everything he could, Elliot asked about something else. And how am I doing? You do what you can. Did I become a good doctor? You already are a good doctor, Elliot. No, what I mean is, am I tougher? Have I gotten used to some of the patients dying? Have I been able to establish some emotional distance? No. You never get used to patients dying. And it's precisely because you decided not to establish emotional distance that you kept on being a good doctor. For a moment, Elliot had such a sense of the uncanny that he got goosebumps. He never looked at things in that way. Then he had the vague sense that time was limited, and he wouldn't be able to ask all the questions tormenting him, so he refocused on the important things. Do I have children? A daughter. Ah, he said, not knowing whether he should be happy about it. Am I a good father? I think so. And Elena, how is she? You ask too many questions. Easy for you to say, you have all the answers. If only that were true. His visitor took a sip of beer, and he too took out a Marlboro. Should I give you back your lighter? Elliot offered, bringing the flame of the Zippo up to the old doctor's cigarette. You can keep it. It'll be yours anyhow one of these days. At the bar, the musicians had started the Beatles song Yesterday, which made Elliot think of a less weighty question. What kind of music do you listen to in the future? There's nothing better than that. And he tapped his foot in time to the music. Did they get back together? The Beatles? No, never. And they can't now. Lennon was assassinated, and Harrison died a few years ago. And McCartney? He's still going strong. The room suddenly grew quiet, indicating that the aquatic show was about to start. The two men both turned toward the whale tank, as the trainers entered, to the applause of a large audience. That's her, isn't it? That's Elena, asked the old man, squinting. Yes? She's replacing one of the trainers. Listen, I can't stay very long. In a few minutes, I'm sure I'll disappear again, so don't take this the wrong way. But in the time I have left, all I want to do is look at her. Not really knowing what this was all about, Elliot watched his double get up and leave the cafe to head for the stands. Elliot is 60. Elliot went down the center aisle to reach the front. The tank was the largest one ever built anywhere, and was divided into 3 sections, with the main pool connected to 2 smaller ones, one for medical care and one for training. The large bay window that extended for nearly 200 feet made it possible to see the whales performing underwater during the show. And the show itself was impressive. The whales moved their vast bulk with amazing grace, jumping, breaching the surface and splashing. But Elliot had eyes only for Elena, who was directing them underwater, guiding the giant beasts the length of the window. Seeing her after all these years had a violent effect on him. He found her unbelievably beautiful, like an angel seen in a dream. For 30 years he had looked at the few photographs he had of her thousands of times, but they did not convey her startling beauty. Overcome by emotion, he felt everything rushing back to him at once. His regret for not having loved her more, not having understood her better, not having been able to protect her. And, as always, the feeling of helplessness and fury at having to surrender to the tide of time that submerges everything in its way. Elliot is 30. Still overwhelmed by what he'd just been through, Elliot sat nailed to his seat while his older double watched the show from the stands. Far from satisfying his curiosity, everything he just learned had only sharpened it. The old man had left his jacket hanging on the back of his chair. Elliot couldn't stop himself from going through the pockets. Oddly, he felt neither ashamed nor guilty. The normal rules clearly didn't apply here. He managed to find a wallet and 2 little cases. The wallet didn't tell him much that was new, except that he found a photo of a pretty young woman of about 20. My daughter, he wondered idly. He looked for any resemblance to Elena, but couldn't find any. Upset by that, he put the photo back where he'd found it and concentrated on the other 2 objects. The first was a tiny black and silver case with a little screen and buttons with numbers on them. He read the word Nokia above the screen, but it didn't mean anything to him. Probably the name of the company that made the device. He turned it every which way, unable to figure out what it could be used for, and then it started to ring. Taken aback, he put it down, not knowing how to make it stop. As the ringing got louder, every customer in the cafe turned toward him, their looks of surprise mingling with disapproval. He suddenly understood, with a flash of insight, that this was a telephone, and even if the call wasn't for him, it seemed logical to press the green button in order to answer it. "Hello?" he said, holding the tiny device to his ear. "It took you long enough." The voice yelling at him, that seemed to be coming from a great distance, was the voice of Matt? "Is that you, Matt?" "Yeah, of course." "Where are you?" "On the estate. Where do you think I am?" "Somebody has to work to keep the vineyard running." "The vineyard? You mean our vineyard? We already bought it?"
You know we bought it 30 years ago. I guess you're still not doing so well, huh?"
"Matt?"
"Yeah?"
"How old are you now?"
"Okay, I know I'm not 20 anymore. You don't have to repeat it every day."
"Just tell me how old you are."
"Same as you, old man, 60.
Elliot paused to get his thoughts together. "You'll never guess what's happening to me."
"With you, I expect the unexpected. Where are you anyhow?"
"In 1976, and I'm 30.
"Sure. Okay, I'll let you go. I have problems at work. For your information, the cases of wine for France won't be able to leave on time. Those bastards are always on strike."
He grumbled and hung up. Elliot couldn't help smiling, both touched and flabbergasted by this bizarre conversation. But he hadn't had the last of his surprises. He picked up the other device and saw that there was a plastic cord wrapped around it. He unwound the cord and saw 2 little buttons hanging at the end. The indications right and left gave him a clue. Earphones? He put the 2 buttons in his ears and then looked at the device more carefully. The case, which was barely thicker than a coin, had a color screen and a kind of dial in the middle. He turned it over and read the label. iPod, designed by Apple in California, made in China. He turned the dial and saw on the screen a list of names he'd never heard of. U2, REM, Coldplay, Radiohead. Finally, he found something he knew. The Rolling Stones. He smiled in satisfaction. Here he was on familiar ground. He confidently turned the volume up to maximum and pushed the button marked play. The first guitar chords of satisfaction blasted his eardrums as though a bowing were going through his head. He let out a scream, dropped the device, and pulled off the earphones. Shaken, he hurriedly put the wallet, telephone, and iPod back into the jacket pockets, which they never should have left. The future certainly looked like it would be complicated. Elliot is 60. The show was nearing its end. In the middle of the tank, 2 huge whales, launched like torpedoes, were cutting through the water at startling speed. When they reached the end of the pool, they made a coordinated turn, leaped into the air, and landed with an enormous splash that sprayed the spectators in the front rows with water and foam. Elliot got a little salt water on his face, but he was so hypnotized by Elena that he barely noticed. For the grand finale, she climbed to the top of the crossbar above the tank, holding a fish between her teeth. For a few seemingly interminable seconds, the audience held its breath until Anushka, the dominant whale in the tank, heaved her enormous bulk out of the water and delicately seized the fish. Elena bowed to the thunderous applause. As she looked across the audience, her gaze lit fleetingly on the old man, and she was disturbed. He looks like someone... She gave in to a spontaneous impulse and threw him a radiant smile, full of confidence and warmth. For a moment, time stood still. Drowning in that smile, Elliot knew that this was the memory he would take away with him. So now he had what he had asked for from the old Cambodian. He'd seen the only woman he'd ever loved again before he died. His wish had just been fulfilled, and he'd have to be satisfied with that. Then he felt a rush of blood in his throat, and his mouth was filled with a metallic tang. He was suddenly out of breath as the trembling that announced his return to the future took hold. He immediately left the stands and headed for the cafe. When he got to his doubles table, he had just enough time to warn him. "This time I'm leaving for good, Elliot. Forget everything I've told you and everything you've seen. Keep on living your life as though you'd never met me." "You're not coming back?" "No, this was the last time." "Why?" "Because your life has to resume its normal course, and because I've gotten what I came for." He was shaking more and more, but he was fully aware that he couldn't just let himself vanish in the middle of the room. Elliot helped him put on his jacket and went with him to the bathroom. "What did you come for?" "I wanted to see Elena again. That's all." "Why?" "Your questions are starting to bug me." But the young doctor was not about to give up. He'd taken hold of the old man by the shoulders as though to keep him from leaving too soon. "Why did you want to see Elena again?" he shouted, pushing him up against the bathroom wall. "Because she's going to die," he was forced to admit. "What do you mean she's going to die? When?" "Soon. She's 29. You don't die when you're 29. Stop being stupid. You're a doctor. You know it can happen at any time." "But why did she die so young?" His eyes full of tears, the other man said nothing. Then just before he disappeared, he said the worst thing possible. "Because you killed her."
End of CD 4.